I should prefer, on account of the row I had with the lady years ago, that this picture should not be called by her name. John Singer Sargent wrote this line in 1916 in a letter to the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was finally ready to sell a painting he had refused to part with for more than 30 years. But he had one condition, that the painting should not carry the sitter's name. What kind of experience stays with you so deeply that even decades later you still feel the need to draw that line? Sargent would describe the word with an unsettling hesitation. I suppose it is the best thing I've done. Not I know, but I suppose. How can the best thing you've ever created also be the one that leaves you so full of doubt? And who was the lady that shouldn't be named? This is the story of one of the most fascinating scandals in art history. In 1916, something changed. For the first time, Sargent was ready to part with the painting that had stayed with him for more than 3 decades. This opportunity came as a surprise, as the director of the Met expressed. I have tried in vain for years to get this painting from him, but for personal reasons, he has always refused to part with it. So his change of decision comes as a surprise. What were the personal reasons that prevent him from selling the painting? This single portrait brought him both extraordinary success and profound distress. It catapulted his career internationally, but it also forced him to leave Paris in disgrace. He crossed continents, became one of the most sought-after portraitists of his generation, and still Madame X remained with him in his studio, in his private space, strangely similar to a Madonna watching over the painter who created her, Holy Lady of Despair. I suppose it is the best thing I have done. This sentence is an open window to his inner conflict, a masterpiece intertwined with disappointment. So was it the best thing he had done? By the time he painted Madame X in 1884, Sargent was already a remarkably accomplished artist. It is worth pausing for a second to look at the kind of painter he had already become. One could expect almost anything from him, from genre scenes unfolding in nature to portraits of the most refined circles of Parisian intellectual society. If there was one subject that truly fascinated Sargent, it was people, and more specifically, the atmosphere that surrounded them. He had an extraordinary ability to construct a visual environment around his figures that elevated them beyond the ordinary. And this fascination extended equally to everyday figures inhabiting their world, as well as to the sophisticated patrons who commissioned his portraits. What truly interested him was the psychology of his subjects, not simply portraying them in a flattering manner, but revealing something deeper, an inner life, a glimpse of a soul, a suggestion of character. Highly influenced by the old masters, particularly Velázquez, Sargent's Paris years are marked by a restrained palette and a dramatic atmosphere, somber, sober, and illuminated by a subdued glow, which leads to an intriguing question. If Sargent was already capable of all this, what exactly was he searching when he chose Amélie Gautreau? Sargent, after all, was a foreigner in Paris. He was American, and therefore something of an outsider to the powerful Parisian circles whose commissions he ultimately depended on. Talent alone rarely catapulted a living artist to success. In the Paris of the Third Republic, a working painter needed not only skill, but sharp commercial instincts and a business strategy. Sargent needed a masterpiece, something spectacular enough to make his nationality almost irrelevant. Up to this point, he had respected certain boundaries. Maybe he had crossed the line a little bit with the portrait of Dr. Bautsy at home, a highly eroticized portrait of a famous French surgeon. But staying relevant in Paris meant pushing further. He needed to present something truly enchanting at the salon after El Jaleo. Ultimately, Sargent understood that a portrait of a captivating woman presented at the salon had the potential to cause a sensation. He was also familiar with the scandal that ensued when Manet's Olympia was exhibited in the salon in 1865. Perhaps Sargent believed he needed to engineer a moment like that for himself, a painting that would define him, and he had already chosen who the woman in the painting would be. Imagine being a 19-year-old girl living in the Paris of the 1870s, a city dazzling and ruthless, a place where beauty is the national pastime. Suddenly you are married to a 40-year-old man, established and somewhat respected. You've been prepared for this your entire life, to marry well, to accommodate yourself in a good position. Your life unfolds in dinners, teas, balls, and charity events, spaces where appearance is a language that you've learned to speak fluently. Amélie Gautreau navigated parties and social gatherings as her main occupation. She profited from her image, and she did it brilliantly. She was always fashionable, and her wardrobe received extensive coverage in the newspapers. She was what people back then called a professional beauty, an insulting suggestion that she worked in her appearance when a woman of her class was not supposed to work at anything. She was discussed, admired, and whispered about. But behind that spectacle, there was a strategy. She knew that her looks, perhaps more than her money or her position, would be the key to her success in society. Amélie was 25 when she met John Singer Sargent, and because she was climbing a social ladder she hadn't been born into, because, like Sargent, she was American-born too, she agreed to let him paint her. She must have felt flattered, chosen, elevated. After all, she trusted him with her image, believing this portrait would seal her position in Parisian society. What she couldn't know was that this portrait would become the most dangerous gamble of her life, because this painting wasn't commissioned, which means that Sargent chose her with an agenda. And when an artist chooses you as a subject, not a sitter, something changes. You stop being a person, you become material. We can't know how aware was she of this dynamic, but when we look at descriptions of her real-life aesthetic, the way she carefully constructed her image, it becomes clear that the woman that people saw in society was not exactly the woman Sargent placed on canvas. In real life, she was often described as an antique statue of absolute regularity of feature, without the slightest defect, with the transparency of alabaster, graceful, endearing. On the canvas, the salon-goers saw something completely different, a woman in a black gown, but not any black gown, a highly sophisticated, form-fitting gown that feels disconnected from the fashion norms of 1884. She doesn't seem to really care about her viewers that much to look them in the eye. Her body, slightly twisted, held in a pose that feels elegant but also uncomfortable, as if she's being arranged rather than simply portrayed. Her hands don't reveal much either. One gathers the folds of the dress, holding a fan and her wedding ring. The other helps maintain the pose. Unlike many of Sargent's sitters, she feels difficult to read. To add up to the mix, the exaggeration of her distinctive features, pale skin, red hair, visible makeup, scandalize the moralists of the 19th century. But what happened? In society, Amélie was praised and her looks celebrated. In the larger-than-life portrait Sargent made of her, she became something else. This wasn't simply a portrait of Amélie Gautreau. It was a portrait of a new kind of woman, the Parisienne, urban, spirited, and independent. But what was one to make with a Parisienne that wasn't French? Was she fully aware of what that image would provoke? Maybe not. But through this painting, Sargent pushed Parisian society to confront something uncomfortable. Women were changing. They were shaping their own image, negotiating power through beauty, redefining what was acceptable. And that was something that Paris was not ready to tolerate. Sargent made around 30 sketches, more than he usually needed for one sitter. By looking at them, something becomes clear. He was searching, trying to capture the silent but powerful cues that made Amélie into Madame X. In some sketches, she is seated. In others, she's reading, toasting, and moving naturally. Why she ended up arranged in such conflicted pose? I like to compare Madame X's pose with this other portrait of the Duchess of Sutherland. It's like Sargent, years later, was still thinking of her. The color of the skin, the pose, the hand, the little table. But the Duchess of Sutherland stares at us. We can read her, meet her eyes. So maybe in Madame X, he wasn't just capturing Amélie. He was trying to construct an image. But either way, society was particularly loud and quick in their disapproval, and eventually everything collided in one place. When people talk about Madame X, they often reduce the scandal to a single detail, the fallen strap. And when you look at the preparatory sketches, the fallen strap was already there. It wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Maybe Sargent considered the fallen strap to be a gesture that revealed Amélie's essence. When the criticism exploded at the salon, he later repainted the strap, placing it back where it belonged, as if correcting that little detail could undo what had already happened. It didn't. The critics critique, the city laugh. The Gautreau family refused to buy the painting, and Sargent later claimed that he had simply painted what he saw. But that raises a question. Did he really painted what he saw? Or did he paint the idea he had created on his mind? Was he able to see Amélie as a person, or was he too fascinated by the image she represented? For a long time, it was easy to think that the scandal was about the strap, but the more you look, the clearer it becomes. It wasn't. The strap was only the spark. What truly unsettled Paris was everything the painting suggested: women shaping their own image instead of quietly fitting into expectations. The painting didn't just show a woman, it hinted a future, and that was far more threatening than a piece of jewelry slipping off a shoulder. So what are we really talking about here? When I think about Sargent, it's the weight of expectations, the thing that really stay with me, and the idealization that led him to paint her. It is known that he began a campaign in 1882 to get her attention and start painting her in 1883, which gave him enough time to form ideas about what he was going to accomplish with this masterpiece. But of course, he was very disappointed because time continued to drag on without the result he was searching for. She was a woman with many commitments and a daughter to care for, and she was reluctant to pose for long hours. Ultimately, I believe the tension that built between them is palpable in the final result. The work is undoubtedly not only a reflection of what he saw, but of what he felt. And in Amelie's case, I find some comfort when I see the portraits she commissioned after Sargent. I think they are a much truer version of her. They show that, contrary to what is said, she recovered from this great disappointment. She always knew the price she had to pay for exposure. I can't help but think she was a really smart, sensitive woman. The final lesson for her is definitely that we must pay attention to the people we let into our lives when what attracted them in the first place was something exterior. Our image. Is that person capable of seeing beyond that? And ultimately, what fascinates me about Madame X is that it's a story that refuses to settle into a single interpretation. It's about unattainable beauty and self-destructive narcissism. It's also about ambitions and insecurities, and definitely also a lesson of how time accommodates everything in the right place, because he eventually became one of the most accomplished artists of his time. This portrait ended up being his masterpiece, and she now lives in a place that's always on display and capturing attention from people all over the world.